So then the question needs to be raised, were the people who wrote all of this just bad at science? Or more importantly, because the Bible seems to suggest these sorts of things, and we know that modern science tells us that the earth is a globe and that there are not in fact pillars holding up the earth, etc., does that mean that the Bible is not true? No, it doesn't. When the proof is sitting in the same civilization that we just talked about. The Babylonians, who wrote a goddess getting split into the sky and earth, also produced this, a real astronomical text from around 1000 BC. It's the oldest known comprehensive astronomical compendium from ancient Mesopotamia. It's star catalogs, calendars, stuff, predictions for when each planet would rise and set through the year. They tracked eclipses, they ran calendars accurate enough to organize the entire empire around, believe it or not, which is really fascinating. There's another text also, the Enuma Anu Enlil, which records thousands of sky observations that were tied to omens. So these people had careful, repeated observations written down by the exact same culture that also said that the sky used to be a goddess's skin. Literally, somewhere in Babylon, there's a guy meticulously logging the exact night that Venus is going to rise. And then literally 2 doors down, there's this guy writing that Marduk skinned the ocean and used it as wallpaper. You know, both of these men consider themselves professionals, but they weren't confused. They could absolutely tell the difference between tracking a planet's path across the sky and then telling a story about where the sky came from. They just didn't file those two things under one category the way that we do it now. There was no word yet for science back then as something separate from religion or history or poetry. There was an accurate way to track the stars, and then there was a true way to explain what the world meant. And nobody in Babylon or Israel felt the need to make those two things argue with each other because nobody even thought that they were supposed to be the same kind of statement. And that's the key to reading Genesis 1 the way that its first audience actually did, which, to reiterate, I have a full in-depth video coming out on this exact same idea, but for the entire creation story. But here's something that I want to communicate, and I didn't come up with this idea, but the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. The theology is for you. It's for anyone who picks up this book in any century, in any language. But the language itself, the assumptions the writers used, the actual picture of the universe sitting underneath all the words, all of that belongs entirely to the people it was first written to. It was never swapped out for a modern one because it was never supposed to be. In other words, when the biblical authors were writing Genesis or writing thousands of years ago, they were writing for their audience. Surprise, surprise. And so then they used language that their audience would have understood. And quite frankly, they didn't care about the things that you and I care about in modern 2026. To them, when they wrote about the earth, they were writing in the context that they understood. They couldn't send a satellite into the sky and observe the actual shape of the earth, and that's fine. Why? Because what they cared about more is who made earth. God did. It wasn't Marduk, it wasn't the other pagan gods, it was Yahweh, the God of the Bible. And this isn't a new idea invented to get the Bible off the hook either. Theologians have a name for this, it's called divine accommodation. It's the idea that when God communicates with people, he meets them where they're at, using the picture of the world that they already have, instead of first uploading a science curriculum into their heads so that the conversation can happen and we can be pleased in our modern reading. Even reformers like John Calvin was already making this exact argument 500 years ago, comparing it to the way a nurse lisps baby talk to an infant. Not because the infant's understanding it, is the point, but because that's the only language the infant can actually receive anything in. The idea goes back even further than that, into the early church fathers. So we should not be surprised when the biblical authors used certain phrases and terms that by our worldview, not scientifically or cosmologically accurate, because they were never trying to communicate that in the first place. Let me explain this with an analogy that I brought up earlier. Think about the way that you already talk about the sun. You say it came up this morning and it'll go down tonight. Your weather app tells you that the sun rises at 6:42 a.m. And every one of those phrases describes a flat, stationary U with the sun traveling across the sky above you, and every single one of them is astronomically false. The sun doesn't rise. You're the one moving, spinning east at 1,000 miles an hour on a floating ball in space. But nobody hears you say, beautiful sunset, and then assumes that you failed 4th grade science because describing the sky the way it looks while you're standing on the ground was never a claim that you made about the orbit of the earth. It's just how people who live under a sky talk about the sky. And the biblical writers lived under the same sky, and they described it from the place that you do, the ground. Genesis is doing the same kind of thing. A psalmist writing that God set the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved isn't making a claim that would survive 5 minutes in a geology class. He's making a claim about who's actually holding everything together, using the only physical picture he and anyone else he'd ever meet would have access to. And God didn't need to rewire the ancient audience's understanding of modern astronomical science before he could tell them something true about themselves. It's the same move that you make every single morning when you wake up and then you say the sun came up. To the ancient mind, the foundations were never the point, who laid them was. Which means that the whole Genesis fight, whether is Genesis compatible with science, does it get the order of creation right, can you actually see the dome in the waters with an actual telescope, is built in a mistake, in my opinion, on what understanding what the Bible actually is. The people arguing Genesis got the universe wrong, and the people trying to prove it secretly got everything right all along, are both treating it like it was trying to answer a question that it never asked. And that particular fight is not as old as what you'd think. The idea that the Bible and science have always been locked in a war with each other. Historians call this the conflict thesis, and it traces back to two specific writers in the 1800s, John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White. It's a modern invention, this idea, not an ancient one, and historians of science have spent decades taking it apart, piece by piece, until, very recently, it was never religion versus science. The word scientist itself is barely 200 years old, and that tends to catch people off guard because before 1833, no one held that job title, because the English language didn't have a word for it yet. People doing this kind of work were called the natural philosophers, and were in categories that sat right next to theology and philosophy instead of apart from them. And then a man named William Whewell coined scientist as a new separate label, and Whewell himself was a Church of England priest, as well as one of the leading intellectuals of his day. Go back even further, Copernicus, the guy who argued that and discovered that maybe the sun is the center of our solar system and not the earth, is a Catholic. Johann Kepler described his own astronomy as thinking God's thoughts after him. Gregor Mendel worked out the basic of genetics in a monastery garden. For most of history, the people tracking the stars and the people writing theology weren't rivals standing on opposite sides of the battlefield. They were often the same person, in the same room, looking at all this and seeing no contradiction at all, and even use their wonder for how God made the world work as their fuel to go out and discover science. So, with all that being said, let's go back to the roof. The dome, the pillars, the ocean sitting overhead, the waters underneath, and the dead underneath everything. None of that needs to be defended, and none of it needs to be debunked either, because the Bible was never making the kind of claim that either side of the modern argument assumes it was making. The people who wrote this down described the universe the only way that anyone in their world could have described it, using the same solid sky, cosmic ocean architecture that their neighbors Babylon and Egypt were already using, and then they use that picture to say something that has nothing to do with plate tectonics or how the earth orbits. They said that God was the one who made it. And seeing that clearly does not mean admitting the Bible got something wrong, and it secretly isn't proving they got something right either. It's reading the book with the people who actually wrote it, meant for it to be read. Written for us, sure, but never quite to us. And once you know the difference, it's hard to argue. I know that this is a very touchy subject for some people, maybe I get it. But ultimately, what I find so fascinating about this is we have to understand, and it sounds rather obvious, that the Bible was not written in 2026 Western America. Like, the context that produced the Bible is the context that we need to understand in order to understand what they were actually writing about and the things that they cared about. They were in a pre-scientific world, and they weren't asking the same kind of questions that we ask today. So it actually takes work like this, going back and understanding the Hebrew, how they use it, the culture that they live in, Greek and Roman culture. This is why I study the Bible to be so fun, because there is no shortage of different things that pick up on every single Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want more of these deep dives like this into the Bible, please consider subscribing. It really does help out the channel. And stay tuned for my Genesis 1 video. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next one.